Let me welcome the panelists of the last conference. So we have already Jolanta Szymańska, Head of European Union Program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. We have Nicolas, we have Edward Lucas, journalist, European correspondent for The Times, also analyst and prospective Liberal Democrat candidate for Westminster, as I remember correctly. And finally, we have Chair Nicolas Tenzer, Senior Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, Chairman of the Center for Studies and Research on Political Decision, Guest Professor at Paris School of International Affairs. I think we're going to have a wonderful panel, and let me pass the mic to Nicolas. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Christophe. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you, Jolanta Szymańska, with my old friend Edward as well. And we will discuss about, which is, in my view, the most important issue right now, which is basically in the case of US abandonment of Ukraine, or mostly abandonment of Europe as such, what Europe, and by Europe I mean also the UK. I mean, I won't separate, Edward, be reassured, the UK, I mean from Europe, neither Norway nor Iceland, I mean as well. What should we do? What can we do? What must we do, absolutely, to protect the security of Europe? And first of all, basically, to win the war in Ukraine. I will have a very brief set of 5 questions for you, but if you allow me, I want to make a very short introduction. My first introduction is about 3 points, which is basically what's the image of Europe abroad right now. Is it basically in Europe the image of a strong Europe or an image of a weak Europe? There are some elements of strength in Europe right now, which is basically the United stance in face of the Russian aggression. The second, reassuring image is basically Europe as a whole, given more support to Ukraine than the US. That's very interesting to contemplate those figures, and we must not forgive, because we must not forget, because when people say, well, if the US go back, well, basically, already Europe did more than the US. Of course, we have the global picture. It depends on the category of weapons, etc. Of course, there's a lot of issues. There are a lot of assets that the Europeans do not have, especially in terms of satellite observations that are very needed, especially for the missiles or drones that Ukraine, of course, is launching against the enemy. But still, Europe is not something that you have to just to say, well, Europe is finished. No, it's not finished. And basically, we can say that there is a new consciousness of Europe after Trump's victory. Too late, certainly, but still, it seems that some countries, including Poland, including the UK, including France, including the Baltic states, including Czech Republic, etc., are basically moving. So there will be one question about what kind of format we will have to envision in the future. But if we consider also other points of Europe, first of all, there is no war economy in Europe. Europe has not transformed itself into a war economy, and I remember my president, Emmanuel Macron, saying in June 2022, we have to transform Europe into a war economy. So it was more than 2.5 years ago. Nothing happened. Okay. The question is basically that we don't have good systems of enforcement, I will say, of the sanctions, especially the EU as such, not talking then about the UK and the US, but the EU as such is still reluctant about secondary sanctions, which is, in my view, a real problem, especially when it comes basically to the circumvention of sanctions. You have a huge vulnerability to propaganda and not enough measures in most of the EU states to punish the people who basically spread Russian lies to the opinions. And also the fourth element is that there is still ambiguities about the real goals that Europe is pursuing, and especially when it comes to Ukraine. Is it basically, as Macron once said, we have to prevent Russia to win? Or is it that we must not allow Ukraine to lose? Or is it we must do everything, whatever it takes, and not only as long as it takes, but whatever it takes, to make Ukraine win at all costs? And also, because that's a precondition, is no, I mean something like a kind of win-win scenario to make Russia lose the war. And there is still an ambiguity and also discrepancies between the EU countries. That's my first point. The second point, just as a brief introduction, is basically I think that there is an imperfect understanding of the very nature of the war in Europe. First of all, most of the European leaders, and including some I was talking to, do not understand that an all-out war waged by Russia. It's a war of exterminations. It's a war of annihilation. It's not a territorial war. It's not a war for territory. It's something completely different. And that, of course, if we have to find a comparison in history, not about tactics, it's not World War I, but World War II. And I think that's the first misconception. The second misconception is basically there is a state of denial. I remember also 3 days ago or 4 days ago, my own president, who is going tough on Russia, said, well, we are not at war with Russia. No, we are not at war with Russia, but Russia is at war with us. And I think we have to be very clear on this kind of narrative. We have to say the thing as they are. The third thing is that basically there is no willingness to take action in Europe. And I remember when Macron finally launched the idea of sending troops to Europe, in terms of communication, it was not, I mean, the most appropriate way to communicate. But still, it was an idea. And I remember the immediate reluctance of most of the EU countries. Some move on after that, but it took time. So the real issue is basically, is Europe ready to defend itself? And the fifth thing, because I think in my view that's completely related, and just referring also to the previous panel, if we consider the war launched by Russia against Ukraine, before Chechnya, Syria, African country, Georgia, etc. I mean, the domination of crime is something that basically decrypts the very nature of Russian war. It's all a war about crimes. And most of the European leaders are not talking about crimes. Of course, they agree to say, well, of course, there must be a trial, of course. But I remember I have some very precise, there are some things that I cannot say because they are confidential. But I remember the reluctance of some leaders to speak regularly about the crimes, to show the crimes, just to make the opinion know about that. They prefer to dissimulate. They are not reiterating the terms of the decision of the prosecutor of the International Court, Criminal Court of March 17th, 2023, which is something quite unprecedented, at least in Europe. And crime matters. International law matters. And I think from European countries, which was basically the place where international law was born, I think it's really important just to recall this dimension of law. And the third thing, which is will be a little bit brief, is basically what should we do, what can we do? Which is something very concrete, which is about basically must we imagine new institutions or not? Should we imagine new formats, basically to wage the war on Russia in a way, one way or another? Should we completely, and at what condition is it possible or not possible, turn the European economies into war economies? What's the implications? And how can we update then the political narratives in order to make it acceptable to the public opinions, which is the key issue. Because right now, of course, the public opinion won't accept it, because they are not aware of the challenges. Because the most of the European leaders, with the exception of someone, especially in the eastern and central part of Europe, are not talking about the real issue of the war. So basically, we perfectly know that if Russia is not losing the war, if Ukraine is not winning the war, we will be the next on the list. Having said that, which was a very brief introduction, I want to ask both Jolanta and Edward some questions. Will be the same question for all of you. The first question is about, how do you analyze basically the geopolitical European unity right now in the face of the Russian war against Ukraine? What are also the pluses and the minuses? What can we do better? What are your hopes, your expectations, and maybe recipes also to improve the situation? Jolanta, please.
Well, thank you. It's of course, preserving European unity among 27 member states is of course not so easy. It's never been easy, but it's getting more and more complicated. It's really complicated when you take into consideration that we have Viktor Orban Hungary on board. So it was always a challenge, especially we could see it while negotiating the sanctions towards Russia or next packages of support for Ukraine. But if we look at the final results, we already know how to deal with Hungary in Europe. The problem is if we limit this specific problem to Hungary, or we will spread this problem. And I think this is now the key issue in the European capitals, how to limit populist influence on internal politics and also European policy and strategy, because especially in the biggest member states, France and Germany, I think that leaders are so focused on preserving and limiting the populist movements that they really lose somehow bigger picture and bigger problems. So before we have this kind of situation, we'll have a huge problem with European leadership. We have potentially the new European Commission, so the strong, new, fresh leadership in the European institutions, but we have really big problems in the capitals. So without capitals, it's really difficult to do anything, because all the important aspects are decided under the rule of unanimity. Let's see how the situation will look like first in Germany, because we have elections at the beginning of the new year, because everybody counts on Germany usually in Europe. So without Germany, it will be really difficult to say something more, but well, currently we have a very specific moment when nothing can be really decided, because we still don't have this European Commission, still don't have stable governments in big capitals. The recent meeting in Warsaw, the meeting of Big Five or even Big Six, because the UK was included, about Eurobonds and support for Ukraine. I don't know if you heard about it, because it's now the issue between Poland and Germany, hard to interpret the agreement for Eurobonds, because this was one of the topics discussed among during this meeting. So this shows that we have a big problem with this unity because still Germany is not really on board when it comes to perception of the problem of security. Currently Poland, for example, is much closer with Baltic states, with Nordic states in terms of security, not necessarily with Germany, but maybe after elections it will be easier with Christian Democrats to discuss this kind of topics. So yeah, I mean, we have very specific moment. We need to wait. Hopefully, it will not be too late for creating this kind of unity. But I think that with unity in the European Union, we always will face a kind of problem. I mean, it's really difficult to find a common solution acceptable for all. In the framework of 27 member states, having so many different interests. And the sad truth about the European Union is that the organization develops from crisis to crisis, and the best actually idea to unite the European Union is to trigger the next crisis around. So this is probably not the best case scenario, but looking from the past and having this perception, historical perception, we can see that ad hoc management is something more characteristic for the European Union than this really long-term strategic thinking. So this is kind of maybe a positive, positive thing about the potential future of this unity. So we will find unity when we will be pushed for this kind of extreme situation somehow.
Okay, thank you very much, Edward.
I'm sorry to be so pessimistic, but I think we are facing a very bleak moment, that Europe faces challenges of a kind it's never faced before, at a time when the capability to deal with these challenges has never been less. And we are going to pay a horrible price for that here, and the Ukrainians are already paying a horrible price for it. They bought us 3 precious years since the full-scale invasion. So they bought us time. And we basically wasted that time. We wasted the time we could have been giving them the weapons that they needed to win. And we wasted that time in terms of building up our own defense and deterrence. Now, I exempt some countries from this because the closer you are to Russia, the better you understand it, and the more you do about it. So we see countries like Poland becoming the strongest conventional military power in Europe, the extraordinary amounts that the Finns and the Baltic states are investing and doing, and that's all very impressive. But if the question is about Europe, I'm afraid Europe was tested and Europe failed. And I'm skeptical that the EU at 27 is going to develop the decision-making power that's needed in time to deal with that. And I'm also skeptical that NATO is able to deal with that. I think we are moving into a post-Atlantic age where, if we're lucky, the United States may remain as some kind of security backstop for the European allies. But it's not going to be the front stop. And at the moment, in most countries, and again, I exempt Poland and Finland from this, but in most countries, the plan is you fight for a few days, but after that, the Americans take over. And we are completely dependent on the Americans for everything from logistics to stockpiles, mid-air refueling, ISTAR, all the stuff you need to fight a peer adversary. We just don't have it. It'll be trillions and trillions of euros to build it on the European side, and we should have started 10 years ago. And even if we start tomorrow, it's going to be very late. So what do? I think we have to build coalitions. Coalitions of the threat aware, for a start, because if countries don't appreciate the threat, then they don't have the appetite for the risk and the cost that's needed to deal with it. And coalitions that are capable, because in the end, it may be symbolically nice to have Liechtenstein on your side, but what you really need is countries that can do stuff. And the good news is that we do have these countries. We have the Nordic 3, the Baltic 3, the Nordic 5, and Poland. And those 9 countries alone have a bigger GDP than Russia. Remember, Russia's GDP is the size of Italy. Now, true, it spends 40% of its government spending, whatever it is, on defense. We spend much less than that, but still, this is not as if we were trying to confront China. We're trying to confront a country which has an economy the size of Italy. So we can do this. We need to radically rethink what we do. I think the big questions really are how we build that North European coalition. We have already the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is UK-led, at least on paper, although UK is failing to lead it. The other 9 countries are very disappointed with the UK. Maybe Poland will become the anchor military power for the JEF. There's also the question of the JEF moving beyond a purely military framework into the sub-threshold threats, which is where the war is actually happening right now. This is where the bombs are going off. They're not coming over on missiles, they're being sent through the post. But this sub-threshold war is raging right now, and we don't have any multilateral framework for dealing with it. There's also the question of the Quad, or the Quint, or the Sextet, the idea that you get France and Germany, traditionally the motors of decision-making in the European Union, together with the Brits, who are indispensable even though they're out, and the Poles, who are now very important. That's the Quad, and then maybe you add Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas from Brussels. That makes it into the Quint, and maybe now that Italy has a strong, stable government with an Atlanticist and security-minded mindset, maybe you bring in Italy and make it the Sextet. I don't really mind. But that's not going to happen soon. France is divided because of the miscalculations of your president and this political deadlock, and Germany is out to lunch for months. So I don't hold any great hopes for this sort of Quad, Quint or Sextet in the short term. And in the short term, we have real problems. Ukraine could break this winter. I've just been hearing private estimates from the international organizations in Kyiv that if Russia succeeds in breaking the heating and power grid in Ukraine, and they've barely started their efforts, we might see 5 million Ukrainian refugees just fleeing the cold and the dark. If the front line breaks, you could triple, quadruple, or quintuple that number. And that could be happening far sooner than we think. And we also have the danger of these sub-threshold attacks going on to which we don't have an answer. So I'm afraid we are facing a very dangerous winter, and we are in no state to deal with it.
Thank you, Edward. Well, I have basically two questions about what you were saying, which is basically, I think the real questions of EU27. I mean, the question is over. We have to move to another format or other formats in plural. And the question is, which kind of format? And how can we basically compensate the institutional strengths of the EU27 that matters and transfer these strengths to other format with EU plus UK plus Norway, let's say, and EU 2023 or 28 or 18, I don't know. And that's, I think, kind of institutional questions. Because at the same time, if we all imagine other formats, if the EU as such is weakened, it will be also a win for Russia. Which is also, I mean, a real dimension. And the second question is a specific questions about Germany. Germany appears right now as the weakling of Europe, especially with Olaf Scholz, as we know, and with his advisor, I know, Jens Plotner, with, I mean, a lot of guys. But of course, he won't be there anymore. We can hope at least, you know, on February 23. But still, there is a German problem. German problem which is not about cooperations, which is basically, I decide, if you agree with me, it's okay. If you don't agree, I don't care. Which is also a problem right now. So there are these two questions. Which kind of format? And then the question of Germany.
Well, I think I'm more optimistic than you, and I still think that the format of EU27 can achieve a lot. And frankly speaking, all the formats that you mentioned, the smaller formats, I consider more as formats of initiations and negotiations, some basic elements of something that should be adopted by EU27. So I don't think that the diversing union, creating this kind of different formats inside the European Union that would work independently on some portfolios and some areas, will probably not work in longer term in the interest of the whole the European Union. I can agree that we have differences, different perceptions on some sometimes basic problems like security and economy. But I still think that we are able to work on a minimum that we can agree in a format of 27 and act together. And that's why I think that we need to think about this kind of smaller formats as element that trigger wider discussion. And this is what I mentioned at the beginning. I can hear and feel in the European Union that there is a strong demand for leadership. I hear it in the context of upcoming Polish presidency, that everybody is searching, wow, Poland, now you have pro-European government, let's initiate. Let's replace Germany or Franco-German tandem, or try to initiate some things. And I think that there is a lot of hope. I hope we will be able to meet the expectations, because expectations are very high. But I will also not be so much skeptical about Germany. I think that we have very specific government now, government which is so unstable and so also disappointing in a sense of both internal and European policy, that I hope we will be able to count on something more after the elections. That's why, in my opinion, it may be a positive, actually, change coming from Germany. And frankly speaking, I don't think that a smaller group of countries can really ignore Germany, and that we can make anything without Germany in the European Union. So still I would opt for building a common minimum rather than creating different formats that would compete one with another. Because this is the way to destroy the European Union, in my opinion. But of course, Poland with the Baltic states, with the Nordic states, can initiate and be a leader in initiating the security agenda, I think. And our main goal in this context is to convince the partners. And I think we have better position now than 1 year ago to convince our partners, and I hope we'll deliver.
Okay, thank you very much. Edward, if you have...
I'm trying to imagine the memo sent to Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin saying, we appreciate the speed with which you want to reshape the world order, but we have to ask you to wait because our decision-making structures do not operate to this tempo. Please wait until we're ready. That's the problem. You know, we had loads of time. We wasted it. Putin didn't. And more than 1 million people are already dead, maimed, traumatized, many more bereaved or in exile as a result of Europe's slowness. And, you know, I understand democracy is, you know, it works like that, but I don't detect any contrition from German partners about the way in which they have been such a huge burden on European security over the past years. The refusal to spend any money on defense, the aggressive dependence on Russian energy, the aggressive rejection of any discussion about Russian hybrid threats. This has been going back a long time, and I think that there's a kind of paradox. We used to think that the big Western countries set the pace. So America was the great spine stiffener for Europe. America would tell the Europeans, spend more, do more, be tougher, catch more spies, depend less on Russian energy. And that was always the dynamic. And Germany was also a kind of engine for raise your economic standards and integrate Europe and so on. And I feel it's kind of the other way around now, that the Americans are not the spine stiffener for Europe, they're the spine slackener. They're the ones who phone you up in your situation room if you're in a frontline state and you have some serious Russian incursion, air, sea, land, whatever, and you're just trying to work out what's going on, and you get a phone call from the National Security Council saying, don't do anything, don't escalate. And politicians of the frontline states are really cross about this. They even speak out publicly. I think Radek Sikorski said it's the constitutional duty of the Polish government to defend Poland. And the Americans have been trying to stop us doing that. And equally, when the frontline states try to do things, you get someone like President Steinmeier making speeches saying we don't want any saber rattling and war cries on the eastern frontier. And so I'm pessimistic about this. I think the Zeitenwende sounded great, but nothing happened. And we have to circle the wagons, to use the American expression. We don't have time on this. Let me just pose you one practical dilemma. Supposing we get a really big sub-threshold attack on Poland or the Baltic states or Finland, combination of Wagner group crossing the border, devastating cyber attacks, drones, all this sort of stuff. And that country says this is an existential threat. This is war. We have to fight back. And they say we want to use our precision weapons to flatten the air defenses in Kaliningrad, and we do it right now, because who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. Do you think NATO is going to allow that? Do you think Sacco is going to say yes, fine? Do you think the Germans are going to say yes, fine? I see huge divisions arising very quickly in Europe, where the frontline states, when they're attacked, want to defend themselves, and the big Western countries will say, oh no, you don't. And we have no way of resolving that conflict.
Thank you very much for this assessment, not really reassuring, but in my view, rather realistic, but that's a personal take. But maybe I will have a last set of questions, because I think that the time is running. Sadly, we can continue over the night, but I have two questions related to that. The first question, very simple, is basically how to deal with Trump's administration. Because there is a temptation of many to behave as lonely riders, basically, and to discuss, bilaterally to Washington, just to grasp some advantage or less disadvantages, let's say. And that the temptation of many European countries could be the temptation of many. I won't name the country, it's not the point, but I think it could be something quite common, especially among the more important country, in Europe. Who create a kind of unity. What are the kind of appropriate mechanism to do that, if useful? The second question is all about NATO, which is a critical issue. Of course, I don't think that Trump or the US and Trump will leave NATO. Certainly not. There is the law passed by the Congress before Trump's elections that prevent, of course, the US from leaving NATO. But you could have a huge budgetary cost. You could have also the US not allowing NATO anymore to provide, elements with the satellites and with all the intelligence that the US only has, a little bit the UK, a little bit France, but not so, a little bit Poland as well, in some other countries. But if we compare the intelligence and the satellites abilities or capabilities of the US with the others, there is absolutely no possible comparison. So just imagine that Trump basically said, no, we don't want. So not leaving, blocking, preventing. So what can we do? I mean, the European countries, including the UK, Norway, etc. What should we do? What could be the tools that we could use?
Well, I think the European Union was preparing for this scenario, for Trump's scenario, for the last few months, and we already could see some attempts to prepare some strategies, like security strategy, like negotiations about defense spending, and so on and so on. We are still waiting for the new Commission, and under the new Commission, the crucial element is the negotiations of the next long-term budget for the European Union. That's why the meeting that I mentioned was about Eurobonds, because the common debt and common taxes and the question how to finance the military spending, the also other spendings related to competitiveness with China and United States are actually consisted in this question about a budget, because everything here is about money. And also the main conflict is about budget usually in the European Union. So hopefully we'll find a solution in the next year, I mean the first half a year actually, because the projects should be prepared. But with Trump, we still have more questions than answers, and we still somehow hope, I think, that not all the announcement from the campaign will come true, that he will be also more realistic somehow than his campaign and program, because the economic competitiveness with United States, it's not in our interest, especially that we are facing so many other challenges, and we would rather would like to see US rather as an economic partner, not an enemy. So in this context, I know that, for example, in a first draft of the program of Polish presidency, there was some hopes for reinvigorating the TTIP project. Now we can see that it will be extremely difficult to come back to this kind of partnership, transatlantic partnership. But I think still we hope for a kind of pragmatism from Trump's side, and also in the field of security. So I think that let's wait and see. But what we what we can do, we can speed up some processes that we already started in the European Union, like this spending on European defense and so on, because we have been discussed a lot about this topic. Now it's really time to act and to pay for this kind of activity. So it's really kind of reality check in the next months for the European Union.
Thank you.
I don't think the European Union has prepared properly for the Trump presidency. There was a huge amount of wishful thinking. I was in America in the run-up to the election campaign. I've spent a lot of time talking to people on the Trump team. And I agree, there's a lot of diverse strands in there. There is a kind of vindictive anti-Ukrainian approach that just hates Ukraine and wants to see Ukraine humiliated. There's also a sort of vindictive anti-European approach from people who've either had their commercial or other interests affected by the European Union. They would like to see the European Union weakened and divided and Europe generally humiliated. That's there, no question about it. But there are other interests as well. There's the China firsters. The China firsters don't hate Europe, they just think Europe's irrelevant. Well, we can prove that Europe is relevant if we were able to say to the administration, look, we understand you're in an existential struggle with the Chinese Communist Party, and you know what? We can help. We are the biggest lump of economic rule-making power in the world, and we're all in. We're going to help, whether it's on electric supply chain resilience, on regaining our edge in critical technologies or whatever. That would get the China firsters to take us seriously. But I have to say, I said to them, don't you agree you need Europe as allies? And they said, Europeans are useless allies. If we're going to stand up to China, we have to do it with the Asian allies who have an interest. You must be joking. You think Germany's going to help us against China? And I had to say, I could see why they said that. I think there's also the personality of Trump, which is very transactional. So we need to find a transaction that suits him. I think the obvious thing to do is to go ahead and seize the $300 billion in Russian central bank assets, which are at the moment mainly in Euroclear and other European places, seize those and spend them in America, spend them on American weapons, particularly spend them on things that are connected with Trump's side, people who donate to him. It's dirty, it's transactional, but that's the way Trump operates. If he can say to his people, Europe is now picking up the tab, we made Putin pay for this war, we're benefiting from it, the American taxpayer is no longer on the hook, then everything changes. But we have to think in a ruthless, devious way, which to me is very unlike the way Europe goes about things. I'm delighted we have Kaja Kallas as our high rep, she gets it. I'm delighted we have Kubilius as the defense vice president. I'm actually delighted we have a Lithuanian as the EU ambassador in Washington. So our team is quite strong, but are we going to make those decisions? Are we capable? I fear I'm dubious.
Thank you very much, Edward. I think, yes, it might be. I mean, which frightens me the most is certainly that we have the Trump's administration will be unprincipled administrations. When you have unprincipled administration, paying absolutely no attention to human rights, to the universality of legal rule of law, to democracy, a liberal principle, then basically it could be nowhere. And so if you don't have a backbone in terms of internal relations, nor doctrinal or ideological backbone, then everything becomes possible. Maybe there is one or two questions from the audience. Please, sir.
Thank you to the panel. I'm not sure whether this was deliberate or not, but not much has been said about the Middle East. Some mention has been made of the Far East, nothing about Africa, where a number of European countries were former colonizers. What is the relationship of Europe with Africa today?
Well, I don't feel like an expert on Africa, and Poland was also not colonizing anyone, I want to mention. But I think that, of course, well, I mean, we have so many problems that we don't think now so much about Africa, let's say, I mean, in the European Union. But we think about Middle East, and here, well, maybe we didn't deliver so much because the previous panel was focused so much on the issue of Middle East. But when it comes to Africa, I think that we think about problems that we can observe in Africa, like rising instability, rising demography, all the issues that we see as threats for the European Union potentially, and as a source of migration and so on and so on. We also see rising influence of other authoritarian regimes like Russia and China. And we also consider this as a huge issue and problem in the European Union. But on this map of all these global problems, I think that we miss a little bit Africa still in the European capitals.
Europe is completely irrelevant in the Middle East. The only countries that matter are the Americans and to some extent the Russians, and the countries actually in the region. And we're deluding ourselves if we think that Europe matters. Nobody takes anything that Europe says remotely seriously. And there is no European policy because European countries are so divided on this. In Africa, we have put hundreds of billions of euros in development aid into Africa and got astonishingly little out of it. The French have been humiliatingly chased out of most of West Africa in the Sahel region, along with the Americans. That's an enormous geopolitical setback, and the Russians are back in Africa, which 30 years ago people would have said was completely implausible. The Chinese influence there goes largely unchecked, except by their own greed, brutality, and incompetence, which occasionally gets them into trouble. I think it's a bit of a mistake to say Africa. We don't like the phrase Eastern Europe anymore, quite rightly. It's lots of different countries, and I think it's also a bit insulting to say Africa as if the Central African Republic, South Africa, Nigeria are all similar countries, or Kenya are similar countries. They're not. So I think we should have a more granular focus. And I think that the failure to get across in Africa that Russia is a colonial power fighting a colonial war against Ukraine, which should be quite an easy sell, even pre-Gaza, that was an enormous failure of EU diplomacy. And the Ukrainians were desperately trying to get EU help to make their case in places like South Africa, but also in Indonesia and Brazil and the other big democracies. And the EU was totally uninterested in helping them make their case because you're not an EU member. So there was a stunning failure of strategic vision and a failure to link the fact that we're paying for a lot of stuff in these countries still. So I'm afraid it's another very big black mark against so-called European diplomacy.
Thank you. I don't know if there is another question from the audience, or we conclude as you wish.
I could have maybe more of a remark in response to what Mr. Lucas was saying. I very much appreciate your very sobering, realistic, pessimistic assessment of our situation vis-à-vis Russia and the situation in Ukraine. I think it's very much justified. But sometimes I'm wondering, listening to voices like yours, wouldn't it be possible to say these things in the, immediately before the Russian invasion started? I can't say that I remember exactly what you specifically were saying then, but this dominating tone of these realistic voices was, we are all doomed. You know, the Ukraine will fall in 7 days. The Europeans will do nothing. The Biden is old and senile. He will be completely ineffective. The Germans are entangled with the Russians. There is Nord Stream. You know, Putin is running circles around us. We are completely doomed. There is nothing we can do. And here we are 3 years later, right? Things have happened, things that we considered to be unthinkable back then. So that's why sometimes I'm slightly suspicious towards such pessimistic tones that you were, that I've heard in your contributions. Thank you.
Well, I've been warning about Russia since the early 1990s. I think you're absolutely right. Ukrainians confounded many observers, but not me, in their ability to resist. I felt the fact that they'd resisted even in the darkest days of 2014 under Yanukovych showed that it was a mistake to underestimate the Ukrainians. I wasn't convinced that Putin was actually going to war. I thought it was more likely to be a kind of bluff to try and extort concessions from the West, but it was a sort of 60-40 judgment. But I am very angry, and I'm angry because we've seen so many people, individuals killed, ranging inside Russia and outside. And the price of Western complacency is not paid by the West. It's paid by people like Politkovskaya, like Navalny, like Litvinenko, like Sergei Skripal. It's paid by the Georgians, now it's paid by the Ukrainians. And we are extraordinarily ready in what I call the comfortable West to be arrogant, naive, willfully ignorant, complacent, and I would say most of all greedy, and not react to the threat we face when it would have been much cheaper and easier. And now it's going to be very dangerous and very difficult, and I'm not sure we're going to win.
Jolanta, you have something to add? No, maybe, well, I will just add some things about, your questions. Because I mean, day after day, especially in my country, France, I am facing a kind of wave of defeatism, especially, in the media. Well, I am one in France who are basically, denouncing, Russia, alerting about Russia in more than 15 years. So basically, I know who the Russian propagandists, even soft propagandists, are. So there is a new wave of defeatism, which is very dangerous. And for those who studied, in my case, Russian propaganda, we perfectly know that's a kind of trick of the Kremlin's narratives. So we have to be very aware of that and beware of not basically magnifying this kind of speech. Of course, on the other hand, we have to be, let's say, realistic about the difficulties of Ukraine. Each time I came back to Ukraine since February 24th, of course I came there many times before as well, I see, the extraordinary resilience, fortitude, courage of the Ukrainian people. But also, at the same time, their despair. Because more than 70% of the Ukrainian population know personally someone, close friends, member of family, etc., who died, who was very severely injured for the rest of his or her life, in his or her body and soul. So it's difficult. But I think the only way that we can survive, in a way, not only the Ukrainians, but also Europe, is basically to find new solutions, to advocate for more support, to find very concrete solutions of things that we haven't mentioned yet, which is basically, for instance, to seize the Russian central bank asset. Because we will have 300 billion euros, including 200 billions in the EU, the rest being in the US, in the UK, and Japan. And that's immediate money. So it doesn't include the taxpayers. So we can do that. We know the reluctance of, especially, not only the Russian propagandists, but also the European Central Bank, and especially Mrs. Lagarde. But we have certainly to advocate more and more about it. That's something very concrete. So I agree. We have basically to keep very strong. And to have the head, basically her head, and to think about what we should do, and not to say, well, just finished. I see all the titles, in the press, or the titles of the TV show saying, basically, can Ukraine survive? Has really Ukraine lost the war? Or sometimes it's not a question mark. It's basically Ukraine has lost the war. So it's very dangerous.
I think it's important. We have to. There's two dangers: a Scylla and a Charybdis, and one of them is this wishful thinking. It's going to be fine. It's just a territorial dispute between Russia and Ukraine. It doesn't have broad implications. There'll be talks. We can fix it. Life will go on. So there's this sort of complacent idea that it's somebody else's problem and not that big one. And then there's also, I agree, this sort of defeatist idea that we're completely doomed and the only thing to do is to surrender. In a way, they kind of meet in the middle, because you can say in the end, we'll sacrifice Ukraine. They're done, but we're not. So, but what makes me angry about this is all being dictated by a country that's got an economy the size of Italy. And we can do this. You look at what Finland does. Finland is prepared to fight alone for 3 to 4 months. They have the ammunitions, the spare parts, the logistics. They have places in shelters, not for 100% of the population of Helsinki, 120%. They're ready. And the burden has not been unbearable on their economy. Look at the Estonians. They're spending 1/4 of their military budget next year on just ammunition. They're buying long-range precision strikes that can hit deep, deep inside Russia. They have lots and lots of ammunition. So we can do this. They've also imposed a 2% income tax, a 2% VAT tax, and a 2% corporation tax surcharge to pay for it all. And they're paying it, yeah, no one likes it, but they're paying it uncomplainingly. So there is leadership out there, there are solutions out there. We can win, we just have to want to win.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Jolanta. Thank you, Edward. Thank you to all of you, especially, of course, to Matthias and Christoph for organizing this wonderful day. See you very soon, I do hope. Thank you very much.